Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more history matters, and this time we are tackling, well, the could be easy, the Ukrainian genocide for the most. But I think, I think the collectivization in the Ukrainian famine. I think that can be. I think most people, definitely just label it as a Soviet um targeted or well, a genocide of the Ukrainian people. I can't remember what the name was. What did it start with an H? The whole home something? Is that it? Ew. I don't know too much aside from a lot of people died. I want to say a few million, five or so Ukrainians died in this as part of Stalin's like 5-year plan or whatever to industrialize um the Soviet Union. But let's just go ahead and dive right into this video and learn, shall we?
1929 and the
Dude.
kulaks are in trouble. Who were the kulaks, you ask? Well, the kulaks were farmers, specifically wealthy farmers who lived in the USSR, whose leader, Joseph Stalin, didn't appreciate their acquired wealth or their objections to his policies. The policy
Mainly their objections to his policies, I think, was the biggest issue here.
that the kulaks particularly disliked was collectivization. This was the process of forcibly taking land from individual peasant farmers and combining them with others under joint control, but under the close watch of the government. These farms, kolkhozes, were ideally supposed to be more efficient and could produce much more food for the growing cities of the Soviet Union. Shockingly, peasants who had been given their land by Lenin were unhappy at having it taken away from them, and so naturally they resisted. These people weren't given much of a choice though, and many were either deported, beaten until they acquiesced, or were simply shot.
Oh.
Over the next 3 years, over 300,000 kulaks were deported either to faraway settlements or to work camps.
Damn.
So collectivization had one major flaw. It didn't work. Crop yields on collective farms were lower than individually held ones, and in 1931 and 1932 grain yields dropped precipitously. There were many reasons.
Well, I think collectivization can work. It needs to be voluntary though. It cannot be something you force upon the people, right? Like again, um the socialist policies do not work when they are forced on the people, but when they are taken upon willingly, they are the most productive, in my opinion, because when you have people with a like minded goal and purpose, they are definitely going to be a lot more passionate and have a lot more drive and innovation, perhaps, at getting things done right. Why we need social safety nets. Anyways, that's a get into a commie yap there. But anyways, forcing it on the people definitely not a good idea, because that's just gonna piss off one group of people. And then the people that you are forcing to like collectivize may not get along, and so they're not really gonna be all that productive together, right? Which is also why working from home is a whole lot more productive than working in an office. But the capitalist overlords care more about control instead of productivity, and so they would rather lose profits and keep office buildings because they want to maintain control over their employees instead of allowing them to continue to work from home, in which it is statistically proven undeniably that working from home for these office jobs is way more productive, just around the board. Anyways.
For this, such as bad weather, pests, and the fact that people with farming knowledge had just been sent to work camp.
Also that too. That's another point that I completely forgot. Yeah, the people that know how to farm kind of lost out.
The decline in crop yields was particularly severe in Ukraine, which had seen much higher rates of collectivization. Shockingly, without crops there was less food, and less food meant starvation and famine. Stalin was further embarrassed when Ukrainian peasants fled the USSR for Poland and quickly spread word of the famine to the wider world. Side note, it's worth noting that the famine didn't simply affect Ukraine, it was widespread throughout the USSR but mostly affected the south. So, how did the Soviet government respond to the famine? The government created a bread
Not
ration
too
for
much.
major cities like the Ukrainian capital of Kharkov, but those in the countryside, i.e., those who grew the food, were left with little. Interestingly, those who had previously been deported to forced labour camps were often given larger daily rations than those who worked on the farms or lived in the cities.
Oh.
Lazar Kaganovich, Stalin's second in command, ordered Stanislav Kostyur, the leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party, to crack down on the peasantry. The government was concerned that starving Ukrainians fleeing Ukraine were demoralising the rest of the USSR and would make collectivization and thus Stalin look bad. As such, the government chose to pull
I mean, Stalin's doing a good job of making himself look bad.
back on collectivization in Ukraine. And just kidding, they banned people from moving throughout the USSR and denied that any famine was happening. Furthermore, any discussion surrounding starvation was seen through the lens of it being a hunger strike orchestrated by Polish spies and Ukrainian nationalists. Also, during the famine, the Soviet Union was still exporting grain, and simply halting this or opening up the nation's extensive grain reserves would have alleviated a great deal of the suffering. Stalin didn't want to, though, since the money raised from selling grain was used to build heavy industry across the nation. This period, known as the Holodomor or the
That's the word.
Terror famine continued until 1933, when crop yields began to increase and were able to feed the now much lower population.
There was no famine.
Estimates vary, but the death toll of the famine in Ukraine is considered by historians to be at about roughly 3 million.
Oh, I was wrong. It's round through. Okay.
In fact, when the USSR conducted a census in 1937, the figures for the population were lower than anticipated, and so Stalin had those who compiled it shocked. The big
Stalin, what the fuck?
debate surrounding
They were doing the job you told them to do. And then they come with you with the, but like, you could have at least, like, not shot them, but fudged the numbers and lied. Like you've been doing. Didn't have to kill them for just doing the job you told them to do. What the fuck? Oh my god. Stalin.
this event is whether or not it should be labelled as a genocide and to what extent who was responsible. That, however, is a debate for another video.
Yeah, it's most certainly a genocide. Right? The government was actively aware that people were starving, and then they actively, did things to keep it going. Right? Like, I think, now, y'all know my personal opinion on the Irish famine. I do believe that should also be considered a genocide, the potato famine. But I think with the potato famine, there is a stronger argument to be made that it wasn't genocide as opposed to this one here. I think if the potato famine is a genocide, then this one is most certainly a genocide. I think this one is because the potato famine, there are some similarities here. The British government was aware of the starvation, and they weren't taking steps to necessarily halt the growing starvation. They weren't really doing anything, but they also weren't, for the most part, again, I'm really rusty on this information. It's been a while. They weren't, from what I remember, they weren't really taking any active steps to continue the famine. And that's sort of happening here. Stalin isn't necessarily taking steps to continue the famine. He is taking steps to make sure people don't hear about it, but he isn't taking steps to really, like, he's not taking steps to either stop it, but he's also not taking steps to keep it going. It's kind of, right, like, once the Ukrainians were able to get their collectivization and their farms running, right, the starvation stopped. Now, of course, Stalin could have brought it to an end sooner, and I think this is largely where the argument of whether or not it is genocide hinges upon your outlook on the wider government's lack of, I guess, care, right? Like, if you see that if you believe that the government is capable, and really, right, we see that both in the Irish potato famine and here in the Holodomor, whatever it's called, Ukrainian famine, we see that both governments here do have the means of providing some more sustenance to the people that are starving, but they don't. I do believe some people inside of the British government do actually try and get the Irish people fed, and that's where a bit of more of the gray area on whether or not it can be considered genocide uh, can be put into play. But here, right, we have a very kind of, there doesn't seem to really be anyone fighting to get the Ukrainians fed. Stalin and his government are very much, no, don't feed them. And so your perspective on that, right, of, okay, Stalin had the means of providing some sort of um, relief, right? He could have provided some grain to them to relieve the famine, but he didn't, right? And so depending on how you look at that, that I think is ultimately where the deciding factor comes in on whether or not it is genocide. If you are someone that believes government doesn't really owe it to the people, which I am not one of these people. If you're one of those people that doesn't believe the government has a responsibility to step in and feed the people in times of famine, then that is not a genocide. However, to push back against that, right, we see that this was caused actively by Stalin's decisions in kicking people out and forcing people to work these collectivized farms. Um, this there's no way to really actively cover this in a meaningful way in so short a time. Right? We could be here for hours debating the intricacies of these decisions. Ultimately, though, right, I consider this genocide. I consider the Irish potato famine genocide. Um, I definitely have probably a more I don't know if it would be stricter view on a more looser view on what would be considered genocide, right? I consider what William the Conqueror did to northern England as genocide. Um, uh, like I'm a lot more, I guess, willing to call things to view things as genocide. Um, and I think here this definitely uh fits. Um, So anyways, that's a lot of yap. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.